Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for joining me. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a one-layer card, and I'm going to be using the Pinkfresh Studio Fancy Bloom stamp set. I am so excited to use this stamp set. This was illustrated by my dear friend Ruby. I will have her linked over in the description as well as over on YouTube and on my blog. This is the first stamp set she's ever illustrated, and I think that she just hit the stamp set out of the ballpark. It is a larger stamp set. It is 6 inches by 8 inches, and she packed it full of these various floral images. I'm going to be using 2 of the larger ones here today. I have a piece of expressive blending card cut down to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I am going to be using the ink on 3 fade out ink because I'm going to be doing some no line coloring, and I'm going to jump right into my coloring here. And the first thing that I want to do is take care of the stamen that are illustrated on the inside of these flowers. I have a dark gray Stettler pen, and I am holding it very loosely in my hand. I'm starting at the base of each of these petals where the stamens connect to the center of the flower, and I'm lightly flicking towards the outer edge of these petals. I'm making sure that I'm following the shape of those petals, so if it looks like it's going to slightly bend to the left, then I touch my pen down at the base of that petal, and then I'll flick out slightly to the left at the same time. This is actually a really easy technique, and you can definitely take a scrap piece of paper, stamp these images a couple times, and practice with this until you get the hang of it. It's the same technique that you would use with Copic markers or colored pencils. For some folks, it's a little bit of a struggle, but with a little bit of practice, you can totally get the hang of it. Super easy. I'm also going to use the Stettler pen first, so I don't have to try to track these down later after I have all of my Copic coloring done. I know that I'm going to be using some very dark, bold colors on this today, and I will lose these if I color over the top of them first. The Stettler pen will definitely shine through that Copic coloring, but it will also tie into it really well. And that's also why I chose the dark gray instead of a black. I actually tested this out before I started this card. The black was just way too much. So the dark gray was perfect. After I get these done, I can start with my Copic coloring on these flowers, and I'm going to start with these red flowers first. I'm going to map out my shade with the BV23. This is going to be pretty dark down in these darker areas, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I'm going for. I want a little bit bolder, darker flower. So I am using quite a bit of that BV23. I did stretch it out pretty far there. You don't need to do that because I'm going to be bringing in the R29, and I have to go over the top of that BV23 past that a little bit. So now that I'm starting to eat up my white space, you could definitely go with shallower strokes here, folks, if you want these flowers to read a little bit lighter. I like the dark, but if that scares you at all, definitely go a little bit lighter. That was the R27, and now I'm going to finish this off with the R24. From here on out, I'm going to kind of alternate between doing one petal at a time to a couple of them at a time. I'm just kind of taking this image in and deciding how I want these to look. So in some cases, I can kind of pull off doing 2 petals at once. In other cases, I need to slow down and only do 1 petal at a time. So this is an example where I'm going to be doing 2 of them at a time. It was illustrated where it looked like you can make that look like one bigger petal. However, I'm deciding to make this 2 separate ones. So I'm right down there at the base of that. I apologize, my hands are in the way. I'm right down at the base of that, flicking up towards the tip of those petals. And then I also take this BV23 right up there on the tip of my marker and stretch that down right where my hand is right now to give those 2 petals a little bit of separation. So I'm actually making it 2 more petals out of the one. Hopefully that makes sense. After I have all of my BV in there, I'm bringing in my R29, going right over the top of that BV23, bringing it out just a little bit past that, and then I'll bring in that R27 and that R24. I'm also making sure that I'm adding that BV23 to some of the tips of these, so I can add that shade in there, and it's going to make them look like they're moving away from the eye. I wouldn't add all of that BV23 to every tip on every petal. In nature, it wouldn't have that anyways, but also you don't want to keep adding too much dark to this because then you're going to start to lose some of that shape. So anything that looks like it could tilt away from the eye, that's where I add the BV23. Now, in other cases, as I'm coloring in these different petals on these different flowers, I'll skip the BV23 on the tip of a petal, but I'll add an R29 as I'm coloring it in. So yes, it's a little bit darker. It will give the illusion that it is moving away from the eye, but it also gives some variation in the shading of these petals. So it looks a little bit more natural, not quite as stark or as deep is what it would be if you had all BV23 on the tips of all of these petals. So I'm going to finish these up and then I'm going to continue to work on each of these petals just like those. I'm going to take them one at a time or maybe two at a time and take it pretty slow. The other thing I'd like to note that as I add my BV23 to these, I will go pretty conservative right down there in the center like I just did. There isn't a whole lot of BV23 down there. Then I'll move on and I'll add a little bit more BV23 to the other center, to other portions of that petal. And I'll kind of go back and forth and look at the centers there, ask myself if I feel like I can add some more to that. If I can, I'll go back in and I'll add more. If I feel like it's enough for now, then I'll leave it. I'm also going to be adding some more color to this with my colored pencils. So I also have that going on in the back of my head while I'm coloring this in. And it's important to keep in mind, folks, so while you're coloring that you can always add more, you cannot take it away. So it doesn't hurt to be a little conservative. Now, I definitely want you all to have the courage to color and to not be afraid, but I feel that that's a little bit different than being conservative. And here's the other thing. If you're going to be bringing in your colored pencils, you can always use them as an aid. Now, you don't want to go into this thinking that you're going to save the day with your colored pencils and you can color everything up if you make all of these mistakes with your Copics, because you can't. And that's kind of not the point of using the colored pencils. The colored pencils are there to help add to the details of your finished images, not to fix everything. However, they can help you out. So if you're looking at this and you're feeling like, you know, I really could have added some more shade here, but you have all of your Copic coloring done, then absolutely add a little bit more of that in there with your colored pencils. Now, some of these petals are kind of coming up towards me, so that means that I actually don't want to add anything to the tips of those petals. Those petals are going to be closest to me, so I want to leave them white as long as I possibly can, and then I'll bring in that R24 like I just did. So all of that shade, all of the darker area was down closer towards the center of the flower, and I kept that as white as I possibly could for as long as I possibly could until I could bring in that R24 and finish it off. And then when I bring in my colored pencils, I'm going to be adding a little bit more highlight towards that edge of the petal that is closest to me to really make it pop and really make it look like it is definitely coming closer towards me than any of the other petals. So now that I'm working on this flower, I kind of skipped the one in between this one and the first one that I colored, and I skipped that one because that one there that is squished up between those, I'm having a hard time getting my eyes to register what that flower means, exactly what it looks like compared to everything else in the image. So in order to make more sense to myself, in order to make it easier on myself, I'm skipping that flower and I'm going to work on this one. Once I have this one colored in, the other one will make a lot more sense to my eye and I can color that one in a lot more appropriately. There is nothing in the rule books that says that you have to go in a certain order when you're coloring in your images. I would definitely do darker things first. In some cases, I would do backgrounds first. But really, when it comes down to it, when you get down to images like this, especially for no line coloring, they're a little bit more complex, a little bit harder to follow. Or if you're new to this and it feels intimidating, I always recommend, and I talk about this all the time, I always recommend with starting with the first thing that makes sense to you. Once you get that out of the way, you can move on to the next thing that makes sense to you and just keep going until you have all of your images colored in. It is so much easier to do that than frustrate yourself or start making mistakes because you're coloring in things that you didn't mean to color them in the way that you did. Now, that being said, here shortly, I'm going to show you how I color in that flower up there at the top. And for me, it's a train wreck. It turns out just fine. However, this is what happens when I don't pay attention. And this is how I have a tendency to struggle. Sometimes I get so confident in what I'm doing, and then I start sidetracking myself with other things while I'm coloring. And then things start going sideways, and then I have to address that. But we'll talk about that more here shortly. Now that I have these first two flowers colored in, I can start making more sense of the next two flowers. So I'm going to knock these out here at the same time. It's the same thing on all of these flowers that I did with these first two. The only difference is I now have to take into account and how they are shaped, how they are impacted by the images around them, the flowers around them. I have to take all of that into consideration and add my shade in accordingly. Otherwise, it's the same technique, it's the same approach, it's colored in almost identical to the first two flowers. Now, this is assembly line coloring, folks. I'm going in with the BV23 on all of the flowers that I want to have BV23, coloring that in. Then I bring in the R29, then the R27 and the R24, and I finish everything off at the same time. Now, there are pros and cons to this type of coloring. The pro is you definitely feel like you're getting them colored in faster than taking things one petal at a time. However, the con is you start to get a little careless in your coloring. Now, it's not the same careless that I'm going to talk to you about here in just a moment, but you do get a little bit more careless because you feel like you're going a little bit faster. So your brain starts to tell your hand to go a little bit faster. And before you know it, you're going in pretty heavy-handed. And sometimes that's how mistakes happen. So you decide on how you want to do it. I catch myself sometimes while I'm coloring assembly line where I'm like, yeah, I just need to slow down and take it easy. But definitely it's up to you. It's a preference on how you want to color. Since this flower was tucked in between these first two flowers, I'm really taking a look at this and really paying attention to where my highlights and my shade are because I don't want this guy to get lost at all. It's still an important flower in this illustration, so I'm making sure that I have enough shade in there and enough highlight in there, and then I'm really going to emphasize that when I come in with my colored pencils too. Now, I want you to take a look at this flower that I'm working on right now. There is a petal there that I tried to make it look like it was bending back away from me. However, I feel like I just got a little too dark there with the BV23. I don't think it had 100% of the effect that I was looking for, but that's okay. I will fix that a little bit later, but that's a really good example of trying to be just a tiny bit more conservative with your darker shades, and you don't need to add it everywhere. I could have totally skipped the BV23 on that particular petal, gone in with the R29, and it would have been just fine. I'm also using the BVs to color in the centers of these flowers. You could color these in an orange or a yellow if you'd like. I just liked the idea of tying that blue violet in with these reds. I love how they look together, so I thought that would be just fine. I went in the darkest shaded area with the BV23 and then blended that out, colored in the rest of that white space with the BV20. Here I'm bringing in that BV23 and I'm adding it into just those darkest areas. So in some cases, it's where one petal overlaps another one. I'm right up there on the tip of that marker and I'm just drawing a very fine, thin line up the edge of that petal. And then I blend that out just a little bit with the R29. It adds just a little bit more darkness and depth in that, so it separates those petals just a wee bit more. Now this flower up here, when it was illustrated, Ruby didn't illustrate this to have the stamen in the center of it. So I took a little bit of creative license there and added that to it. It'll help tie it in with those flowers down there on the bottom. And I'm also going to be using the same colors on those flowers as I did the one there on the bottom. They're not the same flowers, but I'm going to do enough of the same thing to this flower that it will tie in with the other ones, and it'll hardly be noticeable that they're not the same flower. I'm also going in a pretty heavy with these darks on this one. These petals are pretty open, fairly wide, and I know that I want these to be nice and deep and bold. So I am going in pretty heavy. I'm not leaving myself a lot of room for that R27 or the R24. That's fine as long as I leave enough room. I'm just fine. And I'm also making sure that I'm going over the top of each additional color with the next color. That R27 helps brighten up that R29 just a little bit more, and the R24 brightens that up just a little bit more. Now take a look here as I'm adding this R27 and see how much of that white paper I have left. It's not a whole lot. I don't want the highlights on these flowers to be very stark or very bright. They don't need to be. It is absolutely okay to have deep, bold red flowers, and I'm definitely playing on that. Now, if going dark like this is intimidating, or if you're not comfortable with it, not ready to step out of your comfort zone, then shorter strokes on your BV23 and your R29 will work great. I'm also making sure that as I add each of the next color, I go over the top of the previous color, and that will also start to brighten it. You don't want to scrub because you don't want to lift those darker colors, but going over the top of everything with that R24 one final time will definitely brighten things up, and it will feel less intimidating at the end. Okay, so now I'm getting ready to color in this flower, and I start out really well on this. I have the BG57, and I'm going right in those nooks and crannies. This is where my darkest color is going to be, and I'm right up there on the tip of my marker, flicking that out. I go about, some of them are about a quarter of the way up, some of them about half a way up. Some of them I'm going almost up to the tip because I'm adding just a little bit of variation. Now, I want you to note something here. I'm coloring in a bunch of these at one time, and then I'll finish them off. If I were to do this again, I wouldn't do that. However, I was getting ahead of myself. I was feeling pretty confident that, yes, I'm going to color this in, it'll be just fine, and it would have been just fine. I get to right about here, and then I get a phone call, and I'm chatting on the phone while I'm coloring in, and then I start to make some pretty big mistakes that I'm going to have to struggle to fix. Now, if I don't point them out to you, you may not be able to notice them. Amy, I am almost 100% positive you're absolutely going to notice this even before you watch this video. Okay, so I color those in with my BG57. Now I'm bringing in the BG53. Here's where I start to have a problem. Number one, I am not taking the time to blend these in. Not at all. You can definitely see the difference between the BG57 and the BG53. Now, if these were smaller images, I could probably get away with that. However, these are surprisingly pretty big. So I'm going to have to deal with that when I get ready to start coloring with my colored pencils. At this point, I am just moving along here. I'm coloring, I'm chatting, I'm not paying attention. I have a pretty awful blend, and a 57 and a 53 will blend fairly well together if you're paying attention. I am not, and I'm going to have to deal with this when I start working with my colored pencils. So I'm just going to keep trucking along here. I'm going to color these in the same way I had done the other portion of this flower. I'm going to bring in that BG57. I'm adding it where I feel like my darkest area needs to be. And then I'm going to bring in that BG53 and I'm going to call it a day. And I got to be honest, at this point, it hasn't even registered with me that this is a problem. Like, I get so far into this card that it isn't until I start to pick up my colored pencils and I'm like, this is an issue. So I definitely needed to pay attention to what I was doing, and I didn't, but it's fine. We're going to move on. So I also want to color in these little flower buds that are here next to the red flowers. Those could probably be red as well, but I want to tie in some more of that blue-green from that larger flower up on the top here along the side. And then I'm also going to add that some more of that blue-green there on the sprigs below these red flowers. It just kind of makes everything look a little bit more cohesive. And I don't want to bring in too many different colors. It's not necessary. I'm trying to keep the color palette, for the most part, fairly simple and cohesive. Now, on the PDF of this, I have it listed where a darker, more of a moss green for all of the greenery on this. At the time that I filmed this to begin with, I couldn't find that one. So I actually use a lighter green Stettler pen on those really thin vines and sprigs. I honestly prefer the more moss green. I do end up finding it and I do end up going over the top of that lighter green. But if you were doing this for the first time, if you're going to follow along with this, definitely do that moss green. Now here's where I bring in some more of that blue green. And I'm going to show you the difference between how I colored this in and how I colored in that bigger flower. The way this one turned out is the way I wanted that bigger blue-green flower to turn out. So do pay attention to this one here. I added that BG57 down there to the tips of those, kind of flicked it up a little bit. I kept those strokes nice and short, and then I'm blending it out with the BG53. Now I do make sure that I have a much better blend on these. You can see where my marker goes back and forth just a little bit before I move on. That is exactly how I needed that flower up there to turn out. Much, much better. So I do have a few things on here that I did want to bring in one more color to color in. This is a Stettler. It's kind of a yellowish orange, a very light yellowish orange color. And I'm just going to color those in just really quick, nothing spectacular. I'm using the Stettler pens on these because a Copic would be way too fat. Colored pencils would not be as opaque as I want them to be, and the Stettlers work out perfect. I use that lighter yellow to get in the shape. Now I'm coming in with a darker yellowish orange, and I'm just separating where these little balls would be next to each other. It almost adds a little bit of a shadow. It's more of a semi-circle, kind of a short C shape. So each one looks like it has a shadow next to it and separates it from the one that it's sitting next to. Just very short strokes, folks. Nothing too elaborate. These images are really tiny, so you just want to keep everything really fine and short. After I have that darker orange color in there, I bring back that original yellow I had. I go right over the top of it. Stettler pens do stay wet just long enough that you can get a tiny bit of a blend on them and they look pretty cool. So now I'm going to start working on my greenery. Here's the thing with my greenery. I am going to be using mostly the same colors on all of them, with the exception of one color on each of them to give them just enough of variation, but I'll show you what I'm talking about here in just a moment. I'm mapping out my shadow colors with the B34. I'm keeping it right up there on the tip of my marker, keeping those flicks pretty short. I don't want to have too much shade in this. Now, Ruby illustrated this is more of a palm frond. I believe this is frond, or maybe it's a leaf. Regardless, the way she illustrated this is it does have holes in the center of it, but I'm going to skip those because I don't want to deal with them. So I'm just going to color right over the top of them, and because it's no line coloring, nobody but Ruby's ever going to notice. So it's not a big deal. So after I have my B34 in there, I'm bringing in the YG17 and I'm going right over the top of that B34. I went right down the center of this leaf, kind of brought it out in flicking motions from the center towards the edge of this leaf, a lot like a Christmas tree. I also use that B34 and this YG17 to go right along the edge, right there on this leaf, because I do want to have these show a little bit of separation in them, a lot like a palm leaf does, even though that I am skipping the holes, but I'm still keeping my lines pretty thin, pretty fine here. So I'm right up on the tip of that marker, making sure that I'm taking advantage of that tip as much as I possibly can. This leaf is pretty big. It was illustrated to be pretty wide. You do have a little bit of room here to do or to add a little bit darker shaded areas. I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep this fairly bright. I have the depth and the darkness in those red flowers. I'm going to be adding a little bit more darkness to the blue-green flowers. So I want my leaves to be a little bit on the brighter side. Now, I don't want them so bright that they stand out and take away from everything else, but I can afford a little bit of brightness. Once I was done with that YG17, now I'm bringing in the YG13. Now, some of these leaves on this card, I'm using this color combination. The other leaves on this card, I'm going to use the B34, the YG17, and instead of the YG13, I'm going to use a YG03. But we'll talk about that more here in just a moment. I do want to show you this one. It's the same color combination that I just got done using. I'm mapping this out with the B34. I'll go in with the YG17 and then finish it off with a YG13. Here's the problem. So I'm coloring in these leaves and they are straight up and down furthest away from me. However, this is the top of my card. So I'm adding the shade to the bottom of these leaves, but this is the top of my card. So I'm going to turn this card around and my shade is going to be upside down. It's going to be backwards. What I should have done on this is all of that shade should have been there at the top of the leaves instead of the bottom of the leaves. So I should have actually done this backwards. Again, not paying attention. At the end of the day, this one isn't such a big deal. Unless you're looking for it, you're not going to really notice it. But I thought I would talk about it anyway. All right, so I had all of my B34 in there. Now I'm coming in with that YG17. I'm going right over the top of the B34 and then a little bit past that. Now, some of these leaves are just small enough that by the time I get this YG17 in there, that doesn't leave me a lot of room for my YG13. That is fine. Again, we're not going for anything super bright on these. We don't need stark highlights in order for these to stand out. We need just enough that it shows where some light would hit it, and that's it. After the YG17, I'm bringing in that YG13, and I'm going right over the top of the B34 and that YG17. However, I'm making sure that I don't scrub. That YG13 will eat up the B34 and the YG17. So here's some leaves that I'm going to do in a slightly different color combination. Again, I'm coming in with that B34, but as I go in with this B34, I'm varying where I add it. So not all of these leaves are going to be identical. On the one that I had just done, I stretched that out along the top edge of that leaf. On this one, I'm going along the bottom edge of that leaf. Again, on the top of the edge. Some of these I go right up the center, so it almost looks like a V. On others, I just keep it right there at the base of that leaf. So I'm going to vary that a little bit. So when I bring in my other colors like the YG17, go over the top of that B34. And as I start to color these in, it's going to make these leaves look like they have a slightly different shape, but also it's going to make them look like they're facing in different directions. So there's some variation there and they don't all look identical. That's a really easy trick that you can do as you're coloring things in to kind of make things look like they have more natural movement. I'm going to finish this off with the YG03. That YG03 is not as bright as a YG13. It's just enough different from these other leaves that it's not everything is going to match. I did, however, make sure that I mixed up the YG03 and the YG13 leaves between the top and the bottom, so there was some variation between those as well. Ruby illustrated this leaf, so it actually had some lines that ran across the leaf. I'm going to completely ignore those and just kind of do my own thing. I just went right up the center there and then started blending that out. On these leaves, again, I want to add some of that B34 so it looks like some of them are facing away from me. On these leaves, I really want to play up the movement and the dips and the folds within those leaves, so I'm going to add the B34 there. You could skip that. You could just go right down the center with that B34 and start blending it out from there if you'd like. I like this kind of movement in my leaf. In fact, these are my favorite types of leaves to color in. I love how they turn out every time. I did decide that I wanted to add a little bit more to that leaf there after looking at it, so I did bring in a little bit more B34 and added that. Here is the YG17 on this leaf going over the top of that B34, blending that out. As you can see, I did not leave myself a lot of white there. I don't need it, just enough to have some highlight. On this, I'm going to go right over the top of that B34, even over the top where I have those bends and the folds within the leaf. The same thing on this one, making sure that I'm going over the top of that B34 and bringing that YG17 out just enough that I have enough white space for that highlight, but also so I can still see quite a bit of that YG17. The same thing on this one. Now these two leaves are going to get the YG13. This leaf is going to get the YG13. I'm going to go right over the top of all of those colors just like I did on the leaves above. Same with this one. This gets a YG13, making sure that I have a nice blend on all of these. I don't want to eat up that lighter color with the YG13 or the YG03, but I do want to make sure I have a nice blend. Now that I have all of my Copic coloring done, and before I bring in any of my colored pencils, I'm going to add a cast shadow to this flower. I did the one on the bottom, and I'm going to be using a BV25, a BV23, and a BV20. I talk about this in a video, it might have been my last video last week. I do believe it was. And I talk about the difference between the BV23 and neutral grays. Now, this one isn't too shabby. However, it could go either way. If I were to do this again, I would try a neutral gray on this one. Now, the card that I did last week, I should not have used the BVs on them. My recommendation is don't get in the habit to use BVs all the time. While they are great colors and they look fab, the majority of the time, they're not a cure-all. Now, the reason why I would try out a cool gray or a neutral grays on this instead of the BVs isn't because the BVs necessarily look bad. There's enough of a difference between these on this, the images on this card and the cast shadow, that it pulls it off fairly well. However, if you really, really want to make these pop, in this instance, I would have gone with the cools or neutrals because there's enough blues and there's enough blue violets that are already colored in the images that the BVs on this kind of interfere just a tiny bit. You're not going to kill it if you use them, but if you're going to do this, try out neutral grays or cool grays instead of the BVs. Also, I'm not at all concerned with a light source. I don't care. I didn't color in any of these images based on a particular light source. I'm not really going to focus on one when I add my cast shadow, but in some areas I am kind of adding that shadow as if the light source is in the top right, which means that I'm coloring from the bottom left of the image. You don't necessarily need to concern yourself with a light source either. It is not always important. I have been coloring for enough years now, and I've been card making for enough years. I've been in this industry for enough years now that I cannot tell you how often I hear people talk about the importance of a light source. And I gotta tell you, I think that in most cases, probably 90% of the time, in my opinion, I think that it is a total waste of time to even concern yourself with it. Yes, under certain circumstances, a light source is important. Yes, there is a time and a place for a light source. When you are doing cards like this, you do not need to worry about a light source. I've seen more people stress out or hold themselves back because they're afraid of that light source than what is absolutely necessary. It makes me so sad, and it's just not necessary. So don't worry about a light source, folks. Color it in, see what it looks like. If you like it, great. If it looks great, great. If you don't like it and you want to try something different, that's great too. My honest to goodness recommendation is don't hold yourself back and don't worry about that light source unless you absolutely have to. This is a floral card, folks. At the end of the day, the only thing I'm trying to accomplish is that they're pretty and they look like they pop off this card panel even a tiny bit, and that's it. That's all I care about, and you don't need a light source to do it. All right, so enough of that. I am going to blend these edges out just a little bit with my colorless blender. I got kind of heavy on them. I'm one of those folks that I don't like harsh edge on my cast shadow. If you don't mind it, that you can absolutely skip this part. I felt like they were a little too harsh, so I'm bringing in that colorless blender. I do have this sped up because it's not hard, folks, and it doesn't take much to learn how to do this. I'm taking that colorless blender and I'm putting it just barely up to the edge of that B60, and I'm just barely pushing that B60 back to soften that out just a little bit, and that's it. And I'm going to call it good. Okay, so here is the blue-green flower. Now, I want you to keep in mind that while I'm coloring this in, I'm still on the phone, and I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. I'm just coloring. Okay, so I have the Prismacolor in indigo blue, and I'm going right in where I had that BG57. I have a very, very sharp pencil and a super light hand. Anything, a petal that is underneath another petal, I go right up underneath that, add that indigo blue in a very fine, light-handed, thin line, and then I started bringing that out. Now, at this point, I have plenty of space left on these petals. You can see that BG53 is just shining through like a Christmas tree, and that is perfect. Everything is going super fine up until this point. Now, the only thing that I'm struggling with at this point is my blend. I have already realized that I have a very awful blend on these. Indigo blue is a fairly dark color, but it cannot camouflage everything, and I don't want it to camouflage everything because I'm not trying to make this look like a blue flower. It's a blue-green flower. So I have to kind of tread lightly here, so to speak, to go over the top of that BG57 and get it to blend in to that BG53. At this point, not too shabby. I have a light enough hand with that indigo blue. I can bring it out just a touch past that BG57 into the 53, and I'm good to go. However, now I have the Prismacolor Cobalt Turquoise. I go in right over the top of that indigo blue. That's fine, and that's what I need to do. And I start to bring it out over the top of that BG53. And then I start coloring it over the top of everything. So I have lost all of the variation of my color. Most of my depth is gone. I have no highlight left. The blend looks awful. You can see a clear lines. They're very sharp. They're very inconsistent between the petals. They look awful. So at this point, I say to heck with it. I color in all of the cobalt turquoise on all of the leaves, and I'm going to bring in a Derwent white drawing pencil. I'm going to go right over the top of those tips where I feel like I need to have that highlight. This is a very opaque pencil. It is very solid. It's like coloring with soap, as I heard it described, and that is perfect. That is exactly what it feels like. And I'm going to use this as a blend over the top of that cobalt turquoise, and it's going to make a lighter turquoise. And then I'm going to call it a day with this flower. I am not going to stress myself out about it. It does not look great, but we're going to move on because I can't save it, and that is just fine. It's still good enough. All right, so now I'm going to start coloring in my red flowers. At this point, I am so frustrated. I'm so mad. I don't even want to look at blue-green flowers. So now I'm going to skip over to my red flowers, and I'm going to start coloring this in with the Prismacolor in dark purple. I'm going over the top of where I had that BV23. Again, super sharp pencil, really light hand, folks. This is a dark pencil. We're going over the top of a BV23 with an R29. So it automatically looks dark, and I'm making sure over the top of that, just very, very light strokes. I also go down into the center of those flowers, and I just bring out these very fine, thin lines within that stamen. Kind of helps break up that dark gray there, kind of gives everything a little bit more variation, and it looks a little bit more cohesive because we're adding some more texture to the inside of those flowers, almost like they have a tiny bit of a fold, a natural fold within them. Again, you need to keep your hand very light in order to get to those. You can go over the top of them again if you want it a little bit darker, but it's a whole lot harder to take it away if you go in with a heavier hand. Now on these flowers, since I already have all of the Copic coloring done, I don't need it to do 1 or 2 petals at a time. I could go in and add all of my dark purple at one time and then bring in my other colors. At this point, it does get a little bit faster. The only thing I'm taking into consideration at this point is how dark I want to go. I add a couple extra lines here. I was kind of eyeballing that petal as I was coloring everything else in. Decided I wanted to add that fold, so I added a little bit harder lines right down the center of that. Gave myself a little bit more of a natural fold by keeping that in the center pretty light. I just looking at the center of these petals, thinking I wanted to have a little bit deeper folds in those. It gives the flower a little bit more texture, and once I decide I have everything where I want it with the dark purple, I'm going to bring in the Prismacolor in Scarlet Red. I'm going to go right over the top of that dark purple and extend it out just a little bit. Now, not as far as what I had the R27. I am not trying to cover up any or all of my Copic coloring, rather, just getting this to blend in a wee bit. And the Scarlet Red is almost identical to an R27, so you can't quite tell. It's just enough that it gives it a wee bit more color, adds just a little bit more red to it, and it does tone back some of that dark purple quite a bit. And instead of looking dark or on the purple side, going over the top of the dark purple with a Scarlet Red, it makes it look like it just has this lovely punch of red. Now keep in mind while you're coloring this in, folks, you're not trying to cover up all of your Copic coloring. You can leave plenty of that to shine through, especially where you had that R24. And we're going to bring in a white colored pencil here in a minute or so, and we'll add just a few highlights here and there to make it stand out just a wee bit. But all in all of our colors are working cohesively together, and we're giving each one of them an opportunity to shine. Now, I don't know what it is, but I'll typically do on my colored pencil work, I'll typically do, when I have a bunch of flowers like this, one whole flower from beginning to end. It kind of gives me a little bit of a feel for it. It's like a warm-up before an exercise. Like I have to finish that one and really take a look at it and kind of decide if this is the direction I want to go with the rest of my flowers. I don't know why that is, but I do it every time. I can't help myself. Now, from then on out, once I finish that first one, I have zero problems going in with the rest of them and doing that assembly line color. It's just always that first one. I do it every time. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. All right, so now that I have that one done, I am going to come in and do the rest of these flowers the same way I did that first one. Now, there's something I want you to keep in mind with white colored pencils. And I actually haven't known this for very long, but now that I know it, I absolutely pay attention to this every time I do it. White colored pencils, especially the Prismacolor white pencil, when you use that over on your project, if it's the last color that you put on your project, it can look pretty white and pretty stark. But when you come back to it later, take a look at it, folks. Those colors underneath it will start to come up through that white, and that white won't look so bright. So while you're adding that white on there, in some cases you might feel like Later on, I want this to look a little bit brighter, so you can go a little bit heavier on your white. If it looks too bright out the gate, you have two choices. You can either wait for it to kind of settle back over time, or you can take an eraser and you can lift up some of that white. But that's definitely a trick to keep in mind. I didn't know that. And again, now that I do, I pay attention to that every time, and it's been a total game changer how I add my highlights. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to Ruby a whole lot about this stamp set. I know that she was really excited when she did it, and she was super duper proud of herself. She totally should be. She did a fantastic job. But I keep meaning to ask her if she had anything in particular in mind when she illustrated this. Ruby's gig is watercolor. She loves, loves, loves to watercolor. She does it all the time. So I suspect that that's kind of what she was thinking when she illustrated it, something that would be great for watercolor. But I have to wonder if she was taking into consideration any other type of coloring on this. She did a really great job making sure that there was plenty of real estate on almost all of the images in the stamp set. So regardless of whether or not you were doing a watercolor or Copics or colored pencils, you still had plenty of room to color, and I really dig it. This stamp set, folks, even if Ruby wasn't my friend, honestly, truly, this stamp set is just awesome. I love it. Again, I will have this link available for you folks if you're interested in checking it out, and you totally should. It is spectacular, and I really hope that she does some more of these. So now I'm ready to color in the blue greens down here on the bottom of my card. Now pay attention to how I do these. See how much lighter I'm going in with this indigo. I'm not adding nearly as much, and it's not just because these are smaller images. It's also because I have a good blend on these. I'm also adding some of the indigo blue where I didn't have any of that BG57 because again, I want to make some of these look like they're tilting away from me or going more towards me, giving them the little bit of that visual texture. I'm not adding as much indigo blue because I just absolutely don't need it. And now I'm not adding as much of that cobalt turquoise because I don't need it. I'm still on the phone. I'm still only halfway paying attention, but my eye is registering that I don't need as much on here, and it looks way more natural, way better, and certainly a lot less work than the flower above it. I'm going to do the same thing to these little buds here. I'm adding this indigo blue to the bottom right hand and the right hand side of these. I want these to look like they're leaning down towards the right, so I'm putting that heavier shadow there with the indigo blue, and then I'll go in and blend that out with that cobalt turquoise, again leaving a lot of that BG53 to shine through on its own and act as a natural highlight for this, and then I'm going to call it good. I do decide up there to add just a wee bit of white. I wanted those to shine just a teensy weensy bit, but that's about it. I leave quite a bit of that BG53 to shine through. Now to get my little orange flowers here and the orange little berries to look like they're a little bit more cohesive, I went in with a mineral orange over the top of that darker orange and blended that out with a yellow ochre. I did not show you that, folks. It is so easy, just totally not necessary to show that. I am still looking for my moss green, so because I can't find it, I'm going to make kind of my own by bringing in that indigo blue and going right over the top of that green Stettler pen that I had added on here, and then I'll blend that out with the Prismacolor in apple green. You can totally skip this part if you want to. I like going over the top of Stettlers with very sharp colored pencils because it does soften them a little bit. They don't look quite as harsh, quite as stark, and also it's a great way to alter that Stettler pen if you need to. Now, I still personally would have preferred something a little bit more mossy, a little bit darker, but this worked out just fine, and you'll never know that I had a problem with that to begin with. So now I can start coloring in my leaves. The leaves are going to be super duper easy because we pretty much did all of our work with our Copic markers, and we're not going to color over the top of all of this with colored pencils anyways. So I'm going over the top of that B34 with the indigo blue. I will do this on all of the leaves because I used a B34 on all of the leaves. Again, super sharp pencil, super light hand. just adding that indigo blue where I want my darkest shade to be. We will be going over the top of this with a green Prismacolor, and when you mix the indigo blue with a green Prismacolor, it is just gorgeous. It gives you this really lovely darker shade of green that you can't get in a Prismacolor. I love how this turns out every time. I'm a huge fan of it. I did feel like I could deepen up the center of that just a little bit more, so I do so just a tiny bit more. Now in this one, I am gonna go a little bit heavier on those areas that I'm trying to play up where the shape would have some variation to it. So along those edges that I want faced away from me, I will go with just a tiny bit heavier hand, make those lines nice and sharp and a little bit deeper. It will give the eye the illusion that they are moving away from you and they have different shapes to them. Again, on this one, it's the same thing, just adding that indigo blue where I had that B34. I am realizing at this point that my shadow is wrong, and I'm really bummed about it, especially since I wrote the struggle bus with that BG flower. But again, it's not a big deal. Unless you're looking for it, you're really not going to notice it. In fact, every time I look at this card, the first thing that stands out to me, unfortunately, is that BG flower. But what do you do? We're going to call it a day. Lesson learned, and I have zero problems sharing all of my mistakes with you guys. So after I am done with the indigo blue, I'm going to bring in the Prismacolor apple green. That is going to go over the top of everything I had done with the YG17. Now, I had initially used a YG13 and a YG03 on those leaves. On the ones with the YG13, I will be using the Prismacolor in spring green. On everything that I use the YG03, I will be using the Prismacolor lime peel over the top of that. Again, we're not trying to cover up all of that Copic coloring. We don't need to do that. We are just trying to enhance and add a little bit more character and depth and detail with our colored pencils. And I'm not going to show you how I do all of these with the indigo blue and the apple green. It is the same thing that I did with the Copic coloring. You go over the top with the B34 with the indigo blue, over the top of YG17 with the apple green. And then we add or blend these out just a little bit. The YG13 gets the spring green that I'm using right now. And the YG03 gets the lime peel. And then we call it good. Now I'm going to add some more highlights around my images here. I did skip the highlights on these red flowers, the final red flowers after I had done the first one, to wait till the end. Now I'm going to bring that in now. I'm keeping this pretty light in most of these petals. If I want a bend or I'm sorry, anything that comes towards me to stand out a little bit, I do take this Derwent white drawing pencil and I go pretty heavy with that. I love when a flower has a fold that pops right up towards your face and you can really make that stand out. I love that. I don't know what it is. So I have a tendency to go a little bit heavier on that. I'm not using the Derwent drawing pencil on the leaves because I don't want those to be as stark. The Prismacolor white pencil will fade back over time, where the Derwent has a tendency to stay pretty bright for just about ever. So I'm making sure that I'm using those differently on my images here. Just have a couple things left to do here, and then I'm going to be finished up with this card. I do want to add just a little bit of embellishments on these. Now, if you follow me at all, you'll know that my idea of embellishment is adding little things like the Sakura Clear glaze pen, like I'm doing right now. Added those to the yellow flowers over the tops of those buds to make those stand out. I'm stippling them on the center of the red flowers. When that dries back, you're going to be able to see that texture. I don't feel it in completely. On these little orange berries here, I'm just going right over the top of those. I bring that pen straight down, let it pool up, and then I lift up that pen and I get a perfect circle. I also want to add a little bit of shimmer to these to make them pop just a little bit more, and I stick strictly to the highlights. I do not cover up all of my images when I use any type of shimmer pen or any type of sparkle. I think that it adds much more to it if you stick to those highlights. So when the light hits it just right, it looks like it is on purpose. And that is it, folks. We are done. We are good to go. Don't forget, if you were on the flat rate tier, I have a PDF available with the detail supply list, and I also have clickable links over on my blog, so do be sure to check those out. I will also link to Ruby here on Patreon, over on my blog, and my YouTube channel. She is an amazing card maker, artist, and a person, and she definitely deserves some love. She did such an outstanding job on her first illustration for Pinkfresh Studios. And I have a couple more videos linked for you here if you're interested in those. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I hope you enjoyed my card today. Thanks again so much for joining me. Until next time.